The evening sun was slowly sinking behind the wide hills, spreading a soft golden glow across the open land. John Mercer walked along the fence line of his ranch, as he did every evening. The long day had left him tired, but checking on his horses always gave him a sense of calm. The air was warm, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of dry grass and dusty soil. It was the kind of quiet that men living alone knew well, a quiet that could comfort the heart but could also feel heavy on lonely days. John wiped the sweat from his forehead and placed his hand on the wooden fence, giving it a small shake to make sure it was still sturdy. His horses rested peacefully near the water trough, lifting their heads only when he approached. He smiled a little, patting the neck of his favorite brown mare. Moments like this reminded him why he chose this simple life, a life away from noise, rush, or trouble. But as he walked toward the far corner of the fence, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a piece of cloth caught on a fallen branch. The evening light often played tricks, stretching shadows and making shapes that weren't really there. Still, something inside him made him walk closer. The shape didn't move at first. But when John took a few steps nearer, he saw a slight rise of a shoulder, a slow breath, a quiet sound that almost blended with the wind. Someone was lying on the ground. John stopped. His heart beat a little faster, not with fear but with caution. Life on the frontier taught him to be careful. He scanned the area with calm eyes, checking for anyone else around. The land was open, flat, and empty. Not a single rider, not a horse, not a wagon wheel in sight. He walked closer. The person on the ground was a young native man. His clothes were dusty, his hair tangled, and his face looked pale from exhaustion. John could see that the young man had struggled. His steps had probably slowed until he could not walk any farther. His breathing was slow and shallow, as if he had been without water for too long. John took a quiet breath. He didn't know what had happened to this stranger. He didn't know where his people were, or why he was alone. All he knew was that someone needed help. He knelt beside the young man and gently tapped his shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" The young man's eyes opened just a little. They were dark, sharp, but filled with tiredness. He tried to speak, but only a dry whisper came out. His lips were cracked from thirst. John quickly reached for the small canteen tied to his belt. "Here," he said, lifting the man's head carefully. The young man drank the water as if every drop mattered. John watched him closely, making sure he didn't drink too fast. The stranger nodded faintly in gratitude. His eyes softened, showing relief instead of tension. "You're okay," John said gently. "You're safe here." The stranger blinked slowly, as if he understood. John looked around again. Still no one in sight. He knew he couldn't leave the young man lying out in the open. Coyotes, cold night wind, or exhaustion could harm him. This land, while beautiful, was unforgiving for anyone alone and weak. So John lifted the young man's arm over his shoulder, helping him stand. The stranger tried to take a step, but his legs shook. He leaned against John for support, but there was no sign of resistance or fear, only trust and exhaustion. "It's not far," John said. "Just lean on me." Together, with slow steps, they walked toward the barn where John kept tools and extra supplies. The horses inside whinnied softly, sensing a new presence. John guided the stranger to a pile of soft hay and lowered him gently. The young man sat with his back against the wall, breathing deeper now. John handed him a little more water, and he accepted it with both hands. He murmured something, a soft sound. A word John didn't understand, but John could tell it was a thank you. "It's all right," John replied kindly. "Rest now." John stepped back and studied the young man. He was young, perhaps no more than 20. His clothes and handmade beading told John that he belonged to a tribe from the surrounding region. John had seen people from different tribes before, though he didn't know much about their customs. He never had trouble with them, and he tried to respect their land and their ways. But he had also heard stories, some true, some not, about misunderstandings between settlers and tribal people. Stories that made many settlers nervous. John felt none of that now. He only saw someone in need. He fetched a soft cloth and a bowl of clean water. As he gently cleaned the young man's forehead, he noticed a few scrapes and marks on his arms, nothing serious, nothing dangerous, but enough to show he had traveled far and faced rough ground. Must have been a hard journey. John whispered more to himself than to the stranger. The young man opened his eyes again and watched John's movements. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze. He didn't pull away, didn't show fear. Instead, he looked relieved to be cared for. After making the stranger comfortable, John went to the small stove at the corner of the barn and warmed a pot of broth. The smell rose softly into the air. He poured some into a wooden bowl and placed it near the young man, showing him to eat slowly. The young man nodded, taking small sips. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, a peaceful, gentle silence that needed no words. When the sky outside began turning darker, John lit a small lantern. The barn glowed with warm light, pushing away the shadows. John leaned against a wooden post and kept watch. He didn't want the young man waking up alone or frightened. The stranger's breathing grew steadier. His shoulders relaxed. At one point, he lifted his hand, placed it gently on his chest, and said, "Tawa." John realized it was his name. "Tawa," he repeated with a nod. "I'm John." Tawa's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. The night deepened, and stars spread across the open sky. John felt a strange sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know why Tawa had come to his land. He didn't know what the morning would bring. But tonight, he knew he had done the right thing. Helping another human being never needed a reason. Tawa soon drifted into sleep, and John wrapped a blanket around him to keep him warm. Then John walked to the barn door and watched the quiet land outside. The moon rose slowly over the hills, painting the ranch in silver light. Everything was peaceful, but deep down, John sensed that this simple act of kindness might carry a larger meaning, something he could not yet understand. As he leaned on the doorframe, he whispered to himself, "Let's hope tomorrow is calm." Little did he know, tomorrow would bring something he never expected, something that would change the rhythm of his simple life forever. The night settled deeply around the ranch, wrapping everything in calm silence. The sky above stretched wide and clear, filled with countless stars that looked brighter than usual. John sat on a wooden stool inside the barn, watching over Tawa, who rested on the soft hay. The gentle glow of the lantern made long shadows dance on the walls, creating a warm, peaceful atmosphere. John felt tired, but he didn't want to leave the young man alone. Not yet. Tawa breathed quietly, his chest rising and falling in a smooth rhythm. His face still showed signs of exhaustion, but the tension in his eyes had disappeared. It comforted John to see him resting peacefully. He didn't know exactly what had brought the young man to his land, but he knew enough to understand that a long journey had left him weak. John leaned back and stretched his arms, letting out a slow breath. The barn felt safe tonight, like a small shelter in a huge world. Outside, the wind moved gently through the grass, brushing it with soft whispers. The horses shifted occasionally, making quiet sounds, but they too seemed calm in the presence of their new visitor. After a few minutes, Tawa opened his eyes, although only halfway. He looked around as if remembering where he was. When his gaze met John's, something warm passed between them, respect, or maybe gratitude. Tawa tried to sit up slowly. John quickly stood and walked toward him. "Easy," John said softly. "You need to rest." Tawa nodded but still tried to sit straighter. His hand reached for the bowl of broth John had left for him earlier. He took a small sip, then another, and his shoulders relaxed again. The warmth of the broth seemed to bring him a little strength. John pulled up another stool and sat close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give space. He didn't want Tawa to feel crowded or uncomfortable. The barn had always been a place where John felt at ease, and he hoped Tawa felt that peace too. They sat quietly for a while. Tawa looked at the lantern, watching the soft flame flicker. He seemed curious about everything: the wooden beams overhead, the horses, the tools hanging on the walls. He observed things slowly, as if each small detail held meaning. John noticed this and smiled. "It's not much," he said, "but it's home." Tawa didn't understand every word, but he understood John's tone. He placed his hand on his chest again, repeating his name softly. Tawa. Then he pointed at John. I'm John, he said again, tapping his own chest. John Mercer. Tawa nodded and repeated the name carefully. John. Hearing his own name in Tawa's gentle voice made John chuckle. He wasn't used to company, especially not someone from a different world. But there was something about Tawa that felt familiar. Something peaceful. It surprised John how quickly he felt comfortable. John grabbed an old blanket folded nearby and placed it across Tawa's legs. The young man touched the blanket gratefully, giving John a small smile. Even though their worlds were different, kindness didn't need translation. The night moved slowly. Sometimes Tawa closed his eyes for a few minutes, then opened them again as if afraid of sleeping too deeply. John stayed awake, knowing the young man needed someone by his side. He didn't want Tawa to wake up alone or confused in a strange place. So he kept the lantern glowing, offering its soft light. At one point, Tawa looked toward the barn door, his expression thoughtful. He lifted his hand and pointed toward the distant hills that were now hidden under darkness. It seemed he was trying to say something important. John followed the direction of his finger. Your home is that way? He asked gently. Tawa nodded slowly. John wanted to ask many things. How far was his home? What had happened to him? Was someone looking for him? But he didn't want to confuse Tawa or pressure him. The young man needed rest more than questions. Sensing John's understanding, Tawa relaxed and leaned back again. He closed his eyes, trusting the moment. John stood up and walked quietly to check on the horses one more time. They were settled and calm, their ears flicking gently as they sensed his presence. He patted the brown mare's neck, whispering, It's all right, girl. We've got a guest tonight. When he returned to the barn's center, Tawa was watching him. Even in his weak state, he seemed aware of his surroundings. John sat back down. Don't worry, John assured him. You're safe here until morning. Tawa lowered his gaze thoughtfully. His fingers touched the wooden floor beside him, tracing small shapes as if thinking deeply. Then he looked up again and made a small gesture with his hands open, palms moving outward. A gesture John didn't understand fully but felt the meaning of. It seemed like a gesture of peace. John mirrored the gesture with a gentle nod, hoping he was responding correctly. Tawa's eyes softened again. Hours passed this way, with neither man speaking much. But silence held its own kind of conversation. Sometimes, two people didn't need language to share understanding. Tawa would occasionally shift his position, and John helped adjust the blanket so he stayed warm. Around midnight, the wind outside grew a bit stronger, making the barn creak lightly. John went to close the door more tightly. As he did, he looked out across the open land. The moon shone bright, lighting the hills in silver. Everything looked peaceful, but John had lived long enough to know that the land could change quickly. When he walked back inside, Tawa was looking at him again, his expression calm but observant. You're thinking about something, John said softly, sitting down again. I don't know what, but I can tell. Tawa tilted his head slightly, then touched his own chest gently before pointing toward the hills again. It was clear he was thinking about his people. John nodded thoughtfully. He wondered if Tawa's tribe was searching for him. Maybe they were worried. Maybe they were nearby. Maybe they didn't know where he had gone. John hoped they would find him soon. It wasn't right for someone so young to be alone, wandering the land without support. But for tonight, at least, Tawa had a safe place to rest. The lantern's flame flickered softly. John felt his eyes growing heavy. But he refused to sleep. He stretched his back and took slow breaths to keep himself awake. Tawa noticed and raised a hand weakly, motioning for John to rest. John shook his head. I'll sleep when the sun comes up. Tawa let his hand fall slowly, understanding John's decision. He closed his eyes again, drifting into another short sleep. His breathing grew steady once more. John watched him for a moment and felt a quiet warmth in his chest. It had been a long time since he had shared a space with someone in such peaceful silence. The night continued, hour by hour. Sometimes Tawa murmured something softly in his native language, small, gentle sounds that John didn't understand but listened to with respect. John didn't interrupt. He let Tawa speak to the air, to his memories, or perhaps to the stars. Just before dawn, a soft glow appeared on the horizon, turning the sky a pale shade of blue. Birds began their early songs, calling out as if greeting the morning. Tawa opened his eyes, sensing the change in light. His face looked a little stronger, a little less tired. John stretched his arms again and rubbed his eyes. "Morning's coming," he said quietly. Tawa looked toward the open window of the barn, where a thin strip of light entered. He sat up slowly, his movements still weak but more controlled than before. John handed him the canteen again, and Tawa drank a small amount. But then Tawa paused. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on something outside. He leaned forward a little, listening. John noticed the change in his expression. "What is it?" he asked. Tawa didn't answer with words. Instead, he turned his head toward the hills again. John stood and walked to the barn door. He pushed it open carefully. The land was calm, the morning light spreading gently. But John felt something different in the air. A distant sound. Faint, almost like the ground whispering, a soft rhythm, a pattern. It sounded like hooves. John listened closely. The sound grew clearer with each passing second. Many hooves, moving together, steady, purposeful. His heartbeat slowed, not out of fear, but out of deep awareness that something important was coming. Behind him, Tawa slowly pushed himself up, leaning on the hay for support. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. John looked back at him. "Is it your people?" Tawa said nothing, but the answer was already in his eyes. The quiet night had ended, and a new day was beginning, one that would bring answers John did not expect, and a meeting that would shape everything that followed. The early morning light spread softly across the open land, painting the hills in pale gold. John stood at the barn door, listening closely. The sound was faint at first, like distant thunder rolling slowly. But it wasn't thunder. It had rhythm. It moved with purpose. Hooves, many of them. Behind him, Tawa pulled himself up, holding onto a wooden beam for balance. Though still tired, his posture had changed. He stood straighter. His eyes were brighter. He recognized the sound before John did. It was a sound that told him something important: his people were near. John stepped out of the barn and walked a few feet into the open air. The breeze brushed gently past him, carrying with it the faint smell of dust rising from the land. The horses inside the barn shifted and made soft sounds, sensing movement in the distance. The sound of hooves grew louder, clearer, and more defined. John squinted his eyes and looked toward the ridge of the distant hill. The sun climbed slowly behind it, brightening the horizon. For a moment, the shapes were shadowed by the light, but then the figures appeared. A group of riders had reached the top of the hill, dozens of them. They moved together in smooth coordination, their horses aligned in a long, graceful formation. The morning sun made their silhouettes sharp and striking. John felt a breath catch in his throat. He had never seen so many riders approach his land at once. Tawa stepped beside him, leaning lightly against the barn wall for support. His face held calmness, not fear. His eyes followed the riders with quiet understanding. These were his people, his tribe coming for him. John watched in silence as the riders began their descent from the hill. Their horses moved with strength and confidence, hooves beating the ground in steady rhythm. Dust lifted gently behind them, forming soft clouds that floated in the rising light. The sight was grand, almost like something from a dream. As they drew closer, John noticed the details: the colorful woven cloths across the horses, the feathers gently swaying from hair and clothing, the calm but serious expressions of the riders. They were not rushing, but they were moving with clear intention. They were here to find someone important to them. John felt a mix of emotions: curiosity, respect, and a slight worry. He didn't know what they expected to find. He didn't know how they would react when they saw him standing beside their young member. He took a slow breath and reminded himself he had done nothing but help a tired traveler. Tawa stepped forward a little, steadying himself. His expression softened, touched with relief. For a moment, he closed his eyes as if thanking the morning for bringing his people safely. The riders slowed as they reached the open area near the barn. One by one, they guided their horses into a broad semicircle around the ranch, forming a quiet, organized shape. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. The only sound was the last few hoofbeats settling into silence. John stood tall, not stepping back, not hiding. He wanted to show respect, and he wanted them to see he was not afraid or unfriendly. He lifted his hand in a small greeting. Tawa walked forward a few more steps. Some of the riders immediately recognized him. Their posture changed. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes softened. A low murmur of relief spread among them. It was clear they had been searching for him. One older man dismounted from his horse. His hair was long, with streaks of gray, and he wore a beautifully woven cloak. His presence carried calm authority. He approached slowly, showing no sign of anger or distrust. Behind him, two others followed, likely elders or leaders of the group. The older man looked first at Tawa, speaking to him in gentle words. Tawa replied softly, nodding and gesturing toward John. Even without understanding the language, John could tell Tawa was explaining what had happened. The older man listened carefully, then turned to John. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two men from different backgrounds, different worlds, meeting in a quiet moment, filled with meaning. John cleared his throat softly and spoke. He came here tired, very tired. I just helped him with water and rest. The older man didn't speak English, but John's tone and gestures made his meaning clear. The elder placed his hand on his own chest respectfully and bowed his head slightly. It was a gesture of gratitude. John felt a warmth spread through him. He returned the nod, feeling the weight of the moment. He had done a simple act of kindness, but it clearly meant much more to them. Another member of the tribe stepped forward, a younger man who knew a little English. He greeted John politely and explained, "Our brother, Tawa. He was far from home. We were looking for him. We thank you for caring for him." His voice was calm, respectful. John felt his shoulders relax. "He needed help," he replied. "I only did what anyone should." "See," the translator repeated John's words to the elders, and they murmured in agreement. Their expressions grew warm, peaceful, grateful. Tawa stood beside John, close enough that his presence bridged the distance between the two communities. He touched John's arm gently, showing appreciation in his quiet way. Then something unexpected happened. One of the elders signaled to several riders. They moved to their horses and began gathering items from leather bags, beautiful woven blankets, small bundles of herbs, decorated pouches, and hand-carved pieces of wood shaped into symbols of meaning. The translator explained, "These are gifts of thanks. Our way is to honor kindness." John felt surprised, nearly speechless. He had never expected anything in return. He watched as one elder placed a soft, warm blanket over his arm. Another handed him a small wooden carving, a symbol shaped with careful hands, smooth and polished. It felt meaningful, though John didn't know its story. I don't know what to say," John murmured. "No need," the translator replied with a smile. "You did a good thing." Tawa stepped closer and gently placed his hand on the wooden carving in John's palm. He nodded, his eyes full of quiet emotion. No words were needed. The tribe then prepared to take Tawa home. Two riders brought a strong horse closer. Tawa touched the horse's neck lovingly, recognizing it. The animal leaned into him as if greeting an old friend. With the help of two men, Tawa slowly climbed onto the horse. Though weak, he sat with dignity and pride. Before leaving, Tawa turned back to look at John. Their eyes met, and in that silent moment, a bond formed, simple, human, warm. Tawa lifted his hand in a small but heartfelt gesture of respect. John felt his chest tighten slightly, moved by the sincerity of it. The translator approached John one last time and said, "Our people will remember this. Always." John nodded slowly. "Safe journey," he said softly. The translator shared the words with the elders, who acknowledged them with kind expressions. Then, With gentle sounds and soft signals, the tribe began to move. Their horses turned gracefully, forming a long line once again. The rising sun caught the colors of their clothes, making them shimmer with bright patterns. Tawa rode near the center, supported by his people. As they began their journey back across the land, John stood still, watching them go. The sound of hooves faded slowly but beautifully. Dust rose behind them, glowing in the morning light like mist. The ranch grew quiet again. John looked down at the carved wooden symbol in his hand and ran his fingers across its smooth lines. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt its importance. For a long moment, he stood there, taking in everything that had just happened. Days on the ranch were usually simple, quiet, predictable. But today felt different, bigger, meaningful, unforgettable. He walked back toward the barn, feeling something new in his heart. He didn't know when or if he would see Tawa again. But he knew this morning would stay with him forever. And though the land returned to silence, John felt less alone than before. The land returned to quiet after the tribe disappeared over the hills, but the calm felt different now. John stood in the middle of his ranch, holding the carved wooden symbol close to his chest. The morning sun warmed the ground beneath his boots, and the breeze moved softly through the tall grass. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. Something inside him had shifted. He walked slowly back to the barn, replaying the events of the morning in his mind. The sight of the tribe riding together, the gratitude in the eyes of the elders, and Tawa's final gesture before leaving each moment stayed with him like a gentle echo. John wasn't used to such meaningful encounters. His life was simple, quiet, and mostly spent alone. Kindness was something he offered freely, but he rarely received anything that touched him so deeply. Inside the barn, the lantern was still hanging from the wooden beam, its flame now small and soft. John blew it out gently, watching the smoke curl into the air. He set the wooden carving on a small shelf near the window. Sunlight touched it, making its smooth surface glow. John traced the carving with his finger, wondering about its story. Perhaps it was a symbol of friendship, perhaps protection, maybe gratitude. Whatever it meant, it felt important. After putting everything in order, John stepped outside again to start his morning chores. The animals needed feeding, the horses needed brushing, and the land always required attention. But even as he worked, his thoughts kept returning to Tawa. He hoped the young man would recover fully and reach home safely. He hoped the tribe understood how deeply he respected their trust. Throughout the day, John caught himself glancing toward the hills, half expecting to see riders returning. But the horizon remained quiet. Life moved at its usual slow pace. He fixed the fence, carried buckets of feed, and checked the water troughs. The sun climbed high, making the ground warm under his boots, and later dipped low, turning the sky shades of soft orange and purple. As the day ended, John walked back to his small cabin and sat on the porch. The sky was wide and filled with stars again, shining like bright silver pins scattered across dark velvet. The quiet night, which once felt lonely, now felt comforting. He thought about the moment when Tawa first looked at him with trust, and how unexpected kindness could change the direction of a person's journey. The next morning, John woke early as usual. The air was crisp, carrying the freshness of a new day. He stepped outside, ready to begin his tasks, when he noticed something unusual near the main gate of his ranch. A small object lay on the ground, half covered by morning dew. Curious, John walked toward it. As he bent down, he found a beautifully woven band, decorated with colorful beads. The pattern was unmistakable. It was made by skilled hands from Tawa's tribe. John looked around the empty land, wondering who had brought it. There were no hooves, no footsteps, no signs of anyone nearby. Whoever had left it had done so quietly, probably during the early hours before sunrise. John held the band gently. It was soft but strong, and the beads caught the sunlight in bright colors. He knew instantly what it meant. The tribe had returned not to stay, but to leave a message of connection, a message of respect, a message saying, We remember. John felt a warm feeling spread in his chest. He didn't need words to understand. Some gestures were powerful without sound. He placed the woven band inside his cabin next to the wooden carving. The two items together looked like symbols of a bond he had never expected to form. He smiled softly at them before stepping outside to begin his day. Weeks passed, each one quiet and steady. The rhythm of ranch life continued: sunrise chores, midday work, and peaceful evenings on the porch. But something about John had changed. He looked at the land differently now. The hills no longer felt like distant borders. The open sky no longer felt empty. The world seemed larger and more connected, as if invisible threads tied him to places far beyond his ranch. Sometimes John caught himself thinking about the tribe. He wondered what stories Tawa might be telling his people. He wondered if the elders spoke of him during their gatherings. He imagined them around their fires, remembering the night their young member found help from a stranger. And he imagined Tawa stronger, happier, surrounded by familiar faces. On certain evenings, when the light softened and the air grew still, John would take the wooden carving and the beaded band outside and sit with them on the porch. He didn't know why, but holding them made him feel peaceful, as if he were part of something bigger than himself, part of a story that stretched across cultures and beliefs. One afternoon, as John repaired a broken post near the fence, he noticed something on the ground again. A small feather, long, white, and decorated with two tiny red beads at its base. It looked carefully crafted, not something a wild bird would leave behind. John picked it up, studying it with quiet appreciation. This, too, must have come from the tribe. Perhaps from a passing rider, or maybe deliberately left behind. The feather was a gentle reminder that their bond still existed, even if miles separated them. John tucked the feather safely into his pocket and continued his work, feeling a warm sense of gratitude. Days turned into months. Seasons changed. The grasses grew tall, then short again. Rain came and went. John lived his life, caring for his land and animals with the same steady dedication. Yet he never forgot the morning when the tribe had appeared across the hills. He never forgot the feeling of standing before them, not as a stranger, but as a friend. One cool autumn afternoon, as John gathered firewood near the edge of his property, he heard a familiar sound. Soft hoofbeats, slow, steady, and unhurried. They didn't sound like many riders, only one. John turned, his heart stirring with recognition. A single horse appeared from behind the trees. On its back sat Tawa. He looked stronger, fully recovered, and dressed in fresh clothes decorated with new beadwork. His hair was tied neatly, and his expression held calm joy. As he approached, Tawa lifted his hand in a warm greeting, the same gesture he had made months ago when he left. John felt a smile spread across his face. He dropped the firewood gently and walked toward Tawa. They met halfway, sharing a moment filled with warmth and quiet meaning. Tawa dismounted and reached inside a small leather pouch tied to his belt. He pulled out a smooth stone carved with intricate patterns. He placed it in John's hand with gentle respect. John looked at the stone. Its patterns were more detailed than anything he had ever seen. Tawa pointed to his heart, then lightly touched John's chest, showing that the gift came from a place of deep meaning. "Friend," Tawa said softly, using one of the few English words he knew. John felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Friend," he repeated. They stood together in the quiet afternoon, surrounded by tall autumn grass and golden sunlight. No words were needed after that. They simply shared a moment of understanding, one that crossed language, culture, and distance. Tawa stayed for a short while. They walked the ranch together, and John showed him the horses, the barn, the land that had been part of the young man's memories now. Tawa listened and observed with a gentle smile, touching the horses' necks and running his fingers through the cool grass. When the time came for Tawa to leave, he mounted his horse slowly. He looked at John one more time. His eyes warm with gratitude, he touched his hand to his heart again, then pointed toward John, a promise of remembrance. John lifted his hand in a peaceful wave. "Take care," he said softly. Tawa guided his horse forward. With calm steps, the animal moved across the field, and soon, the young man disappeared behind the trees once again. John stood quietly, watching until the last glimpse faded. Then he looked down at the carved stone in his hand. Its patterns told a story he didn't know, but he felt the meaning anyway. The bond between them had not ended. It had only grown. John returned to his ranch with a peaceful heart. He placed the stone next to the wooden carving and woven band. Together, the three items formed a small but powerful collection, a reminder of kindness, connection, and friendship. From that day forward, John often looked toward the hills, not out of loneliness, but with a quiet hope. The land was wide, and the world was full of people with their own journeys. But somewhere out there, Tawa lived his life with the same sense of gratitude and peace. And John knew, deep in his heart, that their paths had crossed for a reason, one that neither would ever forget.